There's also Bad Cat
Yeah.
that took off. Like, I'm really bad with names, so I hope I'm not saying like I'm inventing someone, but I believe it was Mark Sampson who was over at Bad Cat, not at Bad Cat, but at Matchless, and then went to Bad Cat for a few years. And then I think he started his own company, but I forget what the name of that brand is. There was another company that he started, but Bad Cat essentially started off from kind of like the Matchless kind of vibe. So that's why if you put like a Bad Cat and a Matchless, one beside the other, they're hard to tell apart because they look exactly the same, right? So I have the Hot Cat 30. I'm not sure where it's situated in terms of the circuit, but the clean kind of reminds me of an AC30, but the distortion part of it is just bonkers. It's more like distortion, but I do not like that amplifier whatsoever for the distortion. I love the clean out of it, but the distortion sounds like shit, and the effects loop is one of the worst I've ever dealt with.
Okay.
And I know that currently, trying to remember his name, John, the new owner, John Thompson. I think it's John Thompson. I suck with names.
Okay.
But anyways, the new current owner of Bad Cat is making a lot of changes to some of the older amps that a lot of people were complaining about.
Okay.
So he's listening to his demographic. They're saying, oh, I have the older version. It sounds great, but I didn't like this. I didn't like that. And they're making modification.
Okay.
And a lot of the modifications, they're really an improvement over the original circuit. So if you want kind of like the Vox vibe, but with something new, more boutique with a lot of options and a great resale value, you probably go for Matchless or Bad Cat or Morgan, companies like that. If you buy a brand new AC30 made by Korg, when you sell it, you don't make much money. Like if you look on the used market, especially here in Belgium, the AC10 is like $400. The AC15 is about $500, and the AC30 is about $650 average for the used market. And you're like, why would I buy an AC10 if I can buy the AC30 for just a couple $100 more? So it's like the resale value is not there on those, but they're still good amps. But they do overheat. They do sometimes, if you buy the lower bracket prices, they do lack a lot of features. Like we were talking about the AC10 earlier. The AC10 from today has nothing to do with the original AC10. Like nothing.
Okay.
The original AC10 had EF86 preamps. The new one is working with 12AX7s. They have really, really small input and output transformers. And my personal belief, I'm not a technician, so I really can't confirm, but I think that the smaller output transformers is giving the amp a lot of distortion. So if you use an AC10 and crank up the distortion, man, they drive like crazy. The AC15 and the AC30 don't drive as much. So I think it's all these choices that they make that make these amps kind of like new takes on the old circuits, but they're not the same. And a lot of people have written to me, said, I have an AC10 and it gets hot really quickly, and I find I have to change the tubes often. And if you ever see my video where I take the AC10 apart, it's not a well thought out design. Like, they should have really thought, like, you have to take out so many screws just to get to the amplifier and get to the tubes. You can't just stick your hand in there and take them out. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's not the most well thought out design. And even the AC15, like, you have so many screws to take out, and then you take it out, and then everything's there. So if from a repair standpoint, I'm sure a technician could fix it quite easily, but the AC10, not so much. It's poorly thought out as far as I'm concerned, but it's, and you have this very small gap between the tubes and the speaker. So they're almost touching. I'm thinking, you could have given more of a gap there in the design. They should have thought about, having a cab that would accommodate any speaker choice. So if you want to change a speaker in the AC10, forget about it. You have to stay with a ceramic speaker of about like the same footprint. Because if you want to put an Alnico Blue in there, forget it. It doesn't fit in there.
Yeah, they're too long.
Not unless you take out all the tubes, but then what's the point, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I've had that experience with a couple of so when the whole thing started that everybody needed a compact version of their amp, like a 15-watt version or something, and suddenly everybody had that. Everybody had like a lunchbox amp. That's what they're called, a lunchbox amp.
Yeah.
I experienced the same thing where, for example, there was a lunchbox amp that I'm not gonna name the brand because I don't want to shit on people, but it's like there was an amp that
do it, say it.
No. It's an amp company that we've mentioned in this very podcast. I'm just gonna leave it at that. Okay. And they had an amp that also, apart from the small form factor, had a spring reverb in it. And the issue was that the spring reverb section was too close to the output transformer, and therefore every time you dialed in the reverb, you would have like some weird humming noise coming around, which is like, and at some point I noticed they're not building them in that format factor anymore. They only do the large versions so that there's enough space and enough distance between the spring reverb and the output transformer. But yeah, getting to the output transformer point, that's exactly what Morgan does with a lot of their designs, and especially also with the AC designs, where they're like, okay, that's a great sounding amp, but this needs more balls. It just needs to have more headroom, needs to have like more like power, especially in the lower frequencies. So what they did is they put in huge output transformers. I think Morgan is still using Mercury Mechanics. Mercury Mechanics? I don't know. Mercury. They're called Mercury. Mercury is the company that makes the output transformers. They are huge and they're making a huge sound. And that's, to your points, like small output transformer. Yeah, at some point, obviously, you're lacking headroom. And then when you go in there with a hot guitar or with hot pickups or with a pedal in front of it, or you really drive it to a certain point, it's going to distort like hell. Just has to do with the output transformer.
And that point you just made is super important, because for people who've written to me said, should I get an AC10 or an AC15? It depends. Are you using pedals? Because if you use pedals, don't go with the AC10. It doesn't react the same way. There's not enough headroom there. So if you use something like, let's say, I don't know, a Tube Screamer or a Klon type pedal, you might be fine. But if you get in with a fuzz, forget it. The whole thing just caves in on itself. So the AC10 is more like for the people that are, I just use a guitar and an amp and I just get everything from the amp. That's a perfect amplifier for that. But if you start to incorporate pedals, it's that's where that particular amp starts to fall apart. But the thing is that the sound is great, and I think that's the main takeaway I have from the whole Korg era Vox thing, is that they still sound like Vox. They don't sound like a different amplifier. Sure, internally they might be completely different, but they've managed to encapsulate the sound of a Vox and at an affordable price. But the thing is that they could still just like pony up just a little bit on the goodies that they offer with the amplifiers, because today's musicians are looking for, the effects loop. I personally don't use effects loop, but some people really need it, especially if they're getting all the gain from the amplifier and that they want to use reverb or delays. They don't want to distort those, right?
No.
But if you want that, you can't be with the AC15, so that means you have to buy the AC30. If you play small gigs, you might not want the AC30. And I mean, in terms of volume, one is 15 watts, the other's 30 watt, but what's the difference in decibels? I don't know. But one of them's got two speakers, so I'm sure the perceived loudness is going to be louder with the AC30.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying, is that the thing that these other companies are doing is listening to what people want, and Vox is kind of listening to how can we innovate? What can we do different? So they're coming up with all this gear that sometimes the consumers are not really asking for.
Yeah.
So that to your point, where the criticism that you're bringing about Vox, I think is a good one. They're making good amplifiers, but they're not making what I think is what people want today.
Yeah, 100% agree. That's why we have all these companies who look at like some of the flaws and some of the missing elements to those amps, and then like, okay, I'm gonna come out with a version that's A, completely handmade, B, erases all the flaws, and then C, but like kind of maintains what this amplifier is really about. I've once tried the Morgan AC20. It's an amazing amp. It's an amazing amplifier. Sounds so great. However, there's another aspect to Vox amps that you mentioned earlier, and something we actually talked about like a couple of weeks ago.